My name is Professor Feynman Silva. I am a member of the Anthropology Department here at Bridgewater State College, and I'm also coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. This is one of our final events for Hispanic Heritage Month, and I thought it would be useful for us to focus on Honduras and think about the challenges of democracy in the Americas in light of events that began in Honduras last June. So we have a distinguished guest, a distinguished lecture that will be presented by Professor Agustin Lao-Montes from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Professor Lao-Montes has a PhD in sociology from the State University of New York at Binghamton. His fields of specialty include world historical sociology, globalization, political sociology, sociology of race and ethnicity, states, and nationalism. So I think that he will be giving us some insights into Latin America generally and challenges of democracy movements in the Americas. So I'm very pleased to present Professor Lao-Montes today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Professor Sandra Feynman Silva for inviting me here to this talk and for, let me see how I change from here to, yeah, no, I think I got it. Yeah. Yeah, I think I got it. Thanks for the invitation and for, we just met, but I can see how dynamic you are, and that's wonderful to have colleagues like you organizing this kind of event, which is so important. So I am honored to be here talking to you, and also at the end of I think this is a Spanish Heritage Month, so it's a very important theme to end Spanish Heritage Month, and I am trying to acquaint myself with this. Okay, I think that I got it. I traveled a lot throughout Latin America for over the years. I mean, I said that I live between here and there. And right now I am very, very active because I'm researching for a book on, I call it like, mapping the field of black politics in Latin America. And through that kind of work of research, I also have become very active in issues of racial justice and democracy in general in the region. So it's, I constantly traveling there, and so I'm gonna try to give a kind of panoramic vision of the region and then focus on what's happening in Honduras. And the talk have this title, Contradictions of Democracy in the Americas in the Age of Systemic Crisis, Movement Remaking Boundaries of Empire, State, and Community. And I think that we're living very critical times. I mean, critical in the good sense of period in which whatever we do, whatever it happened, is going to mean a lot. There is a lot at stake. So it's a period of a lot of possibilities on the one hand and a lot of risks on the other hand. So when we talk about a period of crisis, we're talking about a moment in which a lot is going to depend about what we do. So it's a period of fear on the one hand. A lot of people are scared because they don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you look around, you see people losing their houses still in the United States. On the other hand, it's a period of hope and possibilities. And I will say that we'll have to take what's happening in Honduras, actually, paradoxically, in that way, in that light. And you'll see what I mean by that. So what do I mean by this? That sounds like I went to school in Binghamton in programming world historical sociology, and we use this big word, systemic crisis. And you say what kind of animal that is, how you eat that, how you cook that. And so I'm going to start by explaining why do I mean by that, and why I'm trying to frame the whole conversation on those terms. I have a phone here, but it's not because I'm expecting an important phone call from my wife or anything like that. It's that I'm looking at the time. This systemic crisis, which means a profound crisis in the whole system, globally. It's not only one thing, it's a global crisis. People are beginning to talk about the post-neoliberal moment. And actually, we're teaching a course next semester about the post-neoliberal moment. What that means, the post-neoliberal moment. Well, let me try to define that. The first thing is that I define this. Come in, welcome. I define it as a multifaceted and multi-layered crisis. So it's much more than a financial crash that we had last year. No, it is a multi-dimensional crisis: economic, ecological. I mean, the economic is kind of what is more visible and tangible to a lot of people, but it's an ecological crisis. I mean, we are this whole thing of global warming that we all talk about it now. There is a possibility of tsunamis happening throughout the south. If the glaciers that are around Argentina keep going the way that they are, there can be really major catastrophe. I mean, this is no joke. Political, political is a crisis of democracy and of legitimacy, governability. So, I mean, the question of democracy comes, right along with the whole thing of the economic crisis. Social. And the social feels as a crisis of hunger, a food crisis. I mean, the increase on the price of food, the problem of the quality of food, the increase of hunger in the world is something very serious, and it's very serious in the Americas. And I have a quote here from this analyst that said that there is a crisis of civilization in which the very possibility of the extinction of the planet and the very existence of human species are at stake. So what do I mean by crisis? I mean, it's a word that, again, kind of buzzword that many of us use, many of the social scientists use to understand what are the ways in which people are interpreting what's happening in Honduras and what is actually the role of the U.S., which is one of the things that I think that we should talk about in the conversation. Because, again, when we talk about the U.S., we're talking about a pretty complex country. Even the state, the government here, have many different branches, and you cannot ascribe a single intention to it. So there are different actors, different players. So Obama and Hillary Clinton do not have to be in agreement, actually, about Honduras. And that's one of the things that people are arguing. But, whatever those more fine-tuned kind of understanding of what's happening in Honduras, there is an overwhelming issue here, which is really important, and that we should be clear about it and talk about it, which is what we call the decline of U.S. hegemony. What do I mean by that? You remember when Bush-Cheney administration, that there was a group of people, Cheney being one of them, Wolfowitz, etc., the program for the New American Century, no? You heard about that, no? Which is the group of people, the group of conservative statement and intellectuals in the United States who actually were advising Bush. I mean, the real brain behind Bush. Everybody said that Bush didn't have a brain, so that was a brain behind Bush. And it was this program for the New American Century, and it's coming from this principle that the 20th century was the American century. And they wanted the 21st century to be an American century, and the whole doctrine of preemptive strike that is the one that is behind the Iraq war, etc., is actually was coined by this group of people. And this is a group of people who are really concerned because the U.S. do not have the leadership in the world that it had after World War II, which is what we call hegemony. No? Have not only military power, not only, but also political leadership and diplomatic leadership in the world. But that's not the case anymore. And it's not the case in Latin America. So in order to, I'm making a point here that in order to understand what's happening in Honduras, you have to put it in that context. Some of the examples of the, what I call the reconfiguration of the balance of power in the Americas is, for instance, what happened in the last meeting, general meeting of the Organization of American States, just a few months ago, when Cuba was readmitted against the will of the U.S., and actually Hillary Clinton had to be pretty cool and go along with what the majority of the country said. So, I mean, the U.S. is not calling the shots anymore. The U.S. created, actually, the post-World War II order, international and inter-American order, like the Organization of American States, the UN, etc. All of that was created in the post-World War II period of U.S. hegemony, which is not anymore. The U.S. military bases to Colombia, which is a proposal that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, was actually rejected in the summit of the South American Union in last August 28. I was actually in Colombia, and it was fascinating to be there because it was televised, and you know, everybody was looking at that. I mean, like in the public places, everybody was like a telenovela. It looked like the soap opera of the day. So it's just a really, really serious thing. And this plan of to install 7 U.S. military bases in Colombia was rejected. Of course, that President Uribe of Colombia had already signed that, but it was rejected. So it was a diplomatic defeat that is really, really important. And the current situation in Honduras, in which the U.S. is relatively isolated. It was the only country, really, besides its allies, Colombia and Peru, who are unconditional allies of the U.S., that actually didn't reject in an entirely strong way cutting diplomatic relationship with the people who did the coup d'etat in Honduras. So this raises the question, you know, how are we going to define U.S.-Latin American relations in the era of Obama? Does Obama make a difference in terms of this? And what is the U.S. role? I mean, I'm going to leave that as an open question. So this is what I call the crisis of neoliberal globalization and the beginning of a post-neoliberal era. So I haven't defined neoliberalism, which is a word that in the U.S. is less common than in Latin America. I mean, in Latin America, you talk to a peasant movement in Bolivia, or you talk to the people in the black movement in the Pacific Coast in rural Colombia, and this word neoliberalism is a common reference. But in the U.S. it's not, no, because of the political culture here is different, and what are the words that people are familiar with are different here. So neoliberalism, and this is a point 3, one of the things of this new wave of activism, what I call the rise of social movement, many of them making not only specific claims of rights, ecological, ethnic, cultural, gender, sexual, urban, rural, etc. So what happened in the context of this crisis, and I'm saying that this is not just something that happened, but it's a more long-term process that you can trace it to the late 1980s, early 1990s. There is this rise of activism, of collective action, of social movements of all sorts, ecological, feminist, black and indigenous, gay and lesbian, urban and rural movements, etc. And I'm going to talk about them in a second. all of these movements are making those kind of rise, but in addition to that, they are demanding and proposing economic justice and what I call the democratization of democracy. And this idea, follow this idea clearly, because by what do we mean by democracy in this context? It's not simply voting, it's not simply having a representative there, but is a much more active role for the citizens in decision making to be empowered at all levels of society and all different kind of ways. So when we're talking about the democratization of democracy, we're talking not only about liberal democracy or representative democracy, which is the one that we're more familiar with, but we're talking about what I call substantive democracy. We're not simply formally equal in terms of the law, no, by the rule of law, equal as citizens, but we're much more really equal, substantially equal, in terms of all of these sources of inequality: gender, class, race. So that means a much more deeper process of democratization. So that's what I call democratization of democracy. And these movements are asking for that. I have a very clear politics of democratization. So when we're talking about democracy, we have to ground our understanding of democracy in what these movements are doing and what they are aiming for, what they are fighting for. And these movements have what I will call a shared discourse and political project against neoliberalism. And by neoliberalism, I mean it's free market doctrines, of which have this free market doctrine, this idea. Neoliberalism is this ideology that argues that the market by itself is going to be able to solve all the problems. Therefore, government is not supposed to do anything. And you have to privatize, you have to promote free trade agreements in international, in the world economy, and implying mega projects of development. And these movements are against all of these things because they have the experience that this neoliberalism had implied gapping inequalities, no? Had implied the increase of poverty, had implied actually the erosion of democracy instead of what is spelled out by the neoliberals, which is that this is going to increase, it's going to trickle down some supposed economic growth, and it's going to also promote democracy, and the experience has been the opposite. So, against free market doctrine and their consequences in terms of gapping social inequalities, mass marginalization, hunger, social violence, and ecological disaster. And as a consequence, what happened is what I will call a new regional consciousness in Latin America. No, I label it as an academic. We always creating labels in order to survive in the academy and stuff. I call it the critical Latin Americanism. No, it's a revival of the idea that Latin America is a region that has hope for itself and for the world, actually. And pan-Indian Afro-diasporic movements. So you have now actually something happening like in 2010, like what happened in 1992. 1992 was the 500 years anniversary of Columbus. And for the governments, etc., it was like the celebration of the discovery. For the that facilitated the organization of a pan-indigenous movement in the whole region, saying, no, this is 500 years of conquest, of oppression for indigenous people. The same thing is happening actually in 2010, which is going to be the 200 years anniversary of the Latin American independence and republic, and the Black movement is planning to organize mass demonstration across the whole region, saying 200 years of exclusion, of second-class citizenship, of racism against Black people in Latin America that in many ways are invisible, but you're talking about 150 million people, according to the official figures of the Economic Commission of Latin America. So, let me offer a panorama of this new way of social movement and what is being called the pink tide. Isn't that, Isn't that like cute? It's a kind of queering this idea of the left, etc. Yeah, have you heard that no, the pink tide, and there are conferences organized about the pink tide. So what is this pink tide about? So again, arguably, this new wave of social movement is happening since the late 1980s. And, you know, those of you who are like my age, remember that the 1980s was labeled as the lost decade. But, you know, for movement, it wasn't the lost decade. It was a really important one, actually, for Latin American social movement. In Brazil, you have the Workers' Party, which is a new kind of political party. I mean, it's a party that is a kind of coalition between movements and parties. We can talk for years about the Workers' Party and what it represents, etc. Elected a worker to be the president of Brazil, the most popular president in the world, around 80% of approval at the end of his presidency. It's incredible, this thing of Lula. The landless peasant movement in Brazil, which is arguably the largest movement in the world. There could be similar things in India. There are women grassroots organizations in India that could compete with it. But officially, it had 2 million members. Social movement, landless peasant movement in Brazil. And, of course, the World Social Forum, which is a super, I happen to be a member of the International Council of the World Social Forum. And it's a super event when you have, in the last one in Porto Alegre, Brazil, 150,000 people from all over the world, representing all kind of movements. In Bolivia, you have in the 2000 and 2003, the water and gas war metaphors, you know, the struggles of people against the privatization of water and gas, and for people's power, and led by the indigenous movement in Bolivia, which is, along with Guatemala, the two countries in the Americas that have that have indigenous majorities, no? And they organized all of this movement together, what is called Movement for Socialism. It's a political organization that elected Evo Morales as the first indigenous president of Bolivia. In Venezuela, people usually talk about Chavez when they talk about Venezuela. I think that is awfully reductionist way of understanding Venezuela. In order to understand Venezuela, and there is a film that I will recommend. I can send it because I have copies, Sandra, called Venezuela Bolivariana and the Fourth World War, which is about the process in Venezuela, which is much more complex than Chavez. And in 1989, there is an uprising in Venezuela called El Caracazo, which is actually one of the most important uprisings against the consequences of neoliberalism. I can't talk about it now, but those of you who are interested, I think I can send the film, and you'd see, I show it in my classes. In Mexico, of course, the Zapatista uprising in 1994, at the same time, in the very same moment in which the North American Free Trade Agreement is approved, and up to 2006, in which there is another election from a progressive party that is stolen, and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, Democratic Revolution Party, the name itself is interesting, declared a dual government, and people were for months in front of the Palace of Government there. And of course, the other campaign of the Zapatistas, and recently the teacher strike in Oaxaca. That was an extremely important thing, and that is another good film about it. Mexico is a really active place. And you know, I mentioned a lot of this because this is just snapshots of what's happening every day in a region that now, according to many people, is the most active region, people fighting for democracy in the world, and this is largely invisible in the U.S., no? A lot of this. In Ecuador, there have been a few indigenous uprisings. The last one was last week. And again, one of and I'm going to raise the issue of contradictions of democracy. It's not that because there is a president in Ecuador who self-declares socialist and is supposed to be for the people, the indigenous movement is not going to have an uprising against him. So there is an autonomy of the movement here. from any kind of government, which I think is very interesting, and more than interesting is refreshing. This is what democratic process is about, I will say. 3 presidents resigned because of pressures from below in Ecuador in the last 10 years. So, I mean, that kind of power people's mobilization have. The Central America crisis in the 1980s, that there is no way that you will understand Honduras if you don't put it in that context. Of course, since the Sandinista revolution in 1979, that took out of power a dictatorship that was there for since the 1930s, actually, for more than 40 years, and the civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador, and to some extent in Honduras. So don't forget that, so that you can put it in a larger historical context, what it is that happening in Honduras. And to talk about my own country, I am Puerto Rican. In Puerto Rico, tomorrow there's going to be a general strike. Any Puerto Ricans here? Tomorrow, October 15, 2009, there is a general strike in Puerto Rico. No? Because more than 20,000 people has been, this is one of the reasons, not the only one. More than 20,000 people has been fired from government employment because there is an attempt to privatize against neoliberalism in Puerto Rico. So this is a general panorama of what is happening in terms of social movement. So what is the pink tide? I'm going to say 2 things about the pink tide. One is that it's Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And this is what is characterized by Jorge Castaneda, who's a political scientist, as the radical left. He's a Mexican political scientist who was a foreign minister of Mexico. And Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela are usually grouped together. So I want to say a few things about it because it's something that I think that we should talk about, because there is a lot of mythology around Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. The first thing is that these 3 countries have kind of revived the idea of socialism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this idea, well, the socialist project is over. So they started talking about what they call the socialism of the 21st century, which is explicitly anti-neoliberal and anti-imperialist, with some redistributive measures. Whether or not that is socialism and what socialism is, and whether or not that is new, that is an open question. No? And to what extent the socialism of the 21st century is more than a slogan is a highly debated issue in those countries and beyond. But the fact of the matter is, beyond that discussion, which is really large, and I cannot take here, they all democratically elected and result of a new way of social movements. So this is not an imposition, an authoritarian imposition. Chavez is not there because he's imposed himself. He won several elections. And, you know, this is what I would call a new politics of decolonization and liberation. So this is the language that is being used now. We are liberating from oppression. We are liberating ourselves from the chains of colonialism and becoming finally independent. And it's also characterized by what I will call, and this is, of course, those of you who are feminists, is a feminist kind of language and intersectional politics of multiple rights. Not only civil and political rights, but also human rights, ethnic, gender, sexual, economic. And that means a different notion of democracy again. What I call substantive democracy and differential citizenship. And again, a contradiction here, and we talk about contradictions of democracies, to what extent this is really happening, and to what extent there is a new kind of populism, like in Venezuela, a charismatic figure, Chavez, or it's really people's power. And again, there is no easy answer, there is no single answer, because both things are happening. There is an emerging people power at the same time that there is this charismatic figure and there is this populist kind of regime that is trying to impose things from above, but there is a lot of fighting from below to really democratize society. On the other hand, the other side of the pink tide is Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Nicaragua. And looking now at the map in the presentation, it's interesting that Honduras is in the middle of Nicaragua and El Salvador. Because in El Salvador, you have also a progressive government that was elected recently. So, I mean, keep that in mind. Now, when you think why this is happening in Honduras, when it's, on the one hand, you have El Salvador, on the other hand, you have Nicaragua. Social democratic governments coming out of militant social movements, unemployed workers, occupied factories in Argentina. In Argentina, it's fascinating. That is a film called The Wake by Naomi Klein, the famous journalist, about all the occupied factories in Argentina that during the crisis in 2000, the owners of the factories abandoned the factories, workers took them, and they are managing the factories. No? Collectively own and collectively managing the factories. And electoral movement for progressive candidates throughout the region, in all of this country. And demonstrating a negative relationship between neoliberalism and democracy. Not only political, but also economic democracy. And here is a contradiction. This perverse, what I call a perverse convergence between neoliberal regimes on the one hand and a politics of cultural democracy. What do I mean by that? I mean that at the same time that there is these neoliberal regimes that mean economic inequality and lack of political democracy, you have a recognition that black and indigenous people should be accepting equal grounds in the national community, but without offering the possibility that people will be on equal grounds in the national community. So there is a discourse of multiculturalism without any kind of economic and political democracy. So that's what I call a contradiction between cultural justice and economic justice, where you have widespread multiculturalism with gapping social inequalities throughout the region. And I would say Colombia is a prime example of that. And on the other hand, a contradiction between an explicit will for social justice and democratization of power and a profoundly unequal social and political order that does not allow for a redistribution of wealth and power. So, and of course, in the case of Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia, that means an incredible social polarization and what I would call civic wars. I mean, what happened in Bolivia is something incredible. The president of Bolivia cannot travel to Santa Cruz. He has to send the Álvaro García Linera, who's the vice president, to go there because the powers that be and many people following them in Santa Cruz will throw bottles, etc., to the president of the country. So what's happening here is an incredible social polarization based on racial and class, historical racial and class inequalities. So all of this result in what I call a new strategies of regionalization, which I'm not going to go carefully over it because I think that I've taken too much time and I'm going to Honduras now. But in a nutshell, by these new strategies of regionalization, what I mean is that this decline of U.S. hegemony that I was talking about before means that the kind of institutions that were organized after World War II and that were really working until recently are not working anymore. So the countries, these countries of this pink tide, all of these countries that I was talking about have organized new institutions of multilateral cooperation among themselves. Like, for example, the UNASUR, this South American Union that just rejected the U.S. military bases in Colombia, the ALBA, which is the initiative of cooperation that was initiated by Cuba and Venezuela, which created its own bank. Recently, it's called the Bank of the South. I actually have a graduate student in the political economy program at U.Mass who's writing a dissertation of the Bank of the South, which is a bank that is created in order to promote investment and development for the region, not based on transnational corporations, but based on social investment in order to create employment and economic development in the region. So I mean this is a really changed balance of power in the region, and this is what I call redrawing the boundaries of empire and nationhood also. No, in Bolivia and Ecuador, there were constituent assemblies recently that declared each country, Bolivia and Ecuador, plurinational states. So it's not only one nation state, but the indigenous, the black peoples are different nations and different peoples within the same state. So what is the definition of nation and state is being changed by this wave of movements in the region. So how Honduras fit within this whole pictures? First, I want to go a little bit into the facts because there is a lot of confusion here, no? I don't know, how many of you watch Fox News? What are they saying in Fox News about the coup? Have you watched anything in Fox News about Honduras? What are people saying in Fox News? Have anybody seen anything about what they say in Fox News? You haven't seen it? Okay. Well, I do watch Fox News because I think that it's important to get a sense of what's happening in this country and what is the head of some people. Not because I think that they are telling me any truth or because they are enlightening me. But I think that I call that a critique of ideology. Ideology, the way that you are, they teach, the media teach you to think in a given way. In Fox News, the message about Honduras is that there was no coup in Honduras. And the legislators, the Republican legislator, with all due respect if there are Republicans here, argue in majority that there was not a coup in Honduras, okay? So I think that you have to clarify things here. And the government of Obama, I'm not talking about Fox News, I'm not talking about the Republicans now. Obama administration had never said that it was a coup, explicitly, okay? So my first point here is that a democratically elected president is taken away from office and from the country by military force. That is a coup. Because this is what happened in Honduras, no? The 28th of June, President Zelaya was, the military came to his house, he was handcuffed and he was taken away from the country. So that is a coup. Who is Zelaya? No, I mean, Zelaya is a liberal landowner. Zelaya, he was not really, within the pink tide, he will not really be with Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. He will be more with the other really pink tide. And he actually became pink recently also. But at the same time, and this is a quote from Chomsky, the last year's summit, President Zelaya declared that U.S. aid does not make us vassals or give Washington the right to humiliate the nation, and has improved ties with Venezuela, joined Petrocaribe, and in July joining the ALBA, which is this initiative that created the Bank of South of Cuba and Venezuela as well. So Zelaya had joined that kind of new regionalism that I was talking about. And I will say that this is what ultimately lies behind this June 28, 2009 coup that is more than 3 months. So this is not a minor business. This is something that has been happening for 3 months. Why the coup? Here, I want to quote one of the most important analysts of the Inter-American Order and of international relations, professor in U.Mass in Mexico, Maria Esther Ceseña. She said, the coup d'etat in Honduras conducted by a Honduran military forming the School of the Americas. This is the first thing. Do people know what is the School of the Americas? The students, do you know, any of you know what is the School of the Americas? No? The School of the Americas is a school for military leaders from Latin America created by the United States. That it was based in Panama. So the military who conducted it was trained in the School of the Americas. Plotted in communications with a U.S. base in Palmerola, Honduras. So those are facts that I think have to be analyzed. Again, I'm not using a conspiracy theory here because I don't believe in that and things are more complex than that. But the military that did the coup was trained in the School of the Americas, U.S., and it was in communication with the U.S. base in Palmerola, Honduras, consulted with personnel in the U.S. Embassy, and enacted by Honduran oligarchy. Is the first operative of U.S. military buildup. And in the part before that I skipped because I've been speaking for too long, I explained how there is a U.S. military buildup. Even under President Obama, the 4th fleet of the U.S. Navy have been reenacted. So the Colombian bases that I mentioned also, there is a U.S. military buildup in Latin America. No, that's a fact. And the Honduran coup only announces what is coming for those governments who dare to challenge the empire and continue to be chased. And while the fuzzy situation in Honduras deviated the gaze, and all accord that grant immunity to U.S. troops in Colombia was revived to allow for the installation of 7 U.S. military bases. So she is, this political analyst from Mexico, is tying it to U.S. military buildup under President Obama. Greg Grandin, one of the most important scholars, NYU professor, say Micheletti, which is the president put by the coup, has doubled down on his bid to present himself as a backstop against Hugo Chavez-style populism. He told an Argentine reporter that he led the overthrow of Zelaya because the Honduran president turned left. He became friends, Micheletti said, with Daniel Ortega, Chavez, Correa, and Evo Morales. So I think that is very clear why the coup. What happened in Honduras after the coup? Greg Grandin again. The government has suspended civil liberties and shut down independent sources of news, including the TV station Xolusat Sur and Radio Globo. In response to rolling protests throughout Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, to the capital and a big city, security forces continue to round up demonstrators, holding some of the detained in soccer stadium, evoking Chile in 1973. After Augusto Pinochet's junta overthrew Salvador Allende, when security forces turned Santiago National Stadium into a torture chamber. The Comité de Familiares de Desaparecidos en Honduras says, Hondurans are indeed being tortured, burned with cigarettes, and sodomized by batons, and that some of the torturers are veterans of Battalion 316 and infamous Honduran death squad from the 1980s. Honduras risks spiraling into a state of lawlessness where police and military act with no regard for human rights or the rule of law, said Susan Lee, America's director of Amnesty International. 14 people, all opposed to the coup, have been murdered since Zelaya's overthrow, according to a tally released early last week by COFAHED. Then, on October 2, more Zelaya supporters were executed. So this is Honduras after the coup in this 3 months, so that you can get a snapshot of it. What has been the U.S. role? I will say ambiguity is one of it. Now, you had President Obama declaring it himself against it, but not doing much against it. Against Organization of American States and the European Union, the U.S. continued diplomatic relations, designed the Arias plan for negotiations between the coup, the people from the coup and Zelaya, and imposed no sanctions. So in this, and this is a question that I'm not going to explore, partly because we don't have time, and I would like to explore more in the discussion, in the conversation, but partly because it's a complex question that nobody really have a clear answer, is what is the U.S. in this context? Who are the actors in the U.S. government and society that have different kind of vested interests in Honduras? An article by Max Weisbrot called How Much Repression Will Hillary Clinton Support in Honduras says the following. One important actor, the only major country to maintain an ambassador in Honduras throughout the dictatorship, has maintained a deafening silence about this repression. That is the United States government. The Obama administration has not uttered one word about the massive human rights violations in Honduras. It's interesting that they did about Iran in the same period, though. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton described the first phase of this new repression last night in a press conference. I think that the government imposed a curfew, we just learned, to try to get people off the streets so that there couldn't be unforeseen developments. This, in contrast to what the head of the Organization of American States, Inter-American Human Rights Commission, Luis Mejias, had a different view of the dictatorship curfew from that of Hillary Clinton. She called it a clear violation of human rights and legal norms, and said that those who ordered these measures should be charged under international criminal law. What a horrible, ugly message the Obama administration is sending to the democracies of Latin America, it's the same article, and to people that aspire to democracy everywhere. U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States denounced suspension of liberties as silly and deplorable, at the same time that criticized President Zelaya returned as irresponsible, as a way of instigating rebellion, and as behaving like a movie star. So this is the ambiguity that I'm talking about, if that wasn't clear. Honduras may very well be the first reversal in the drive to spread 21st century socialism in the region, as Iran-Contra veteran Otto Rage, a prominent U.S. backer of the coup, recently wrote. So this is the people who are backing the coup in the U.S. And now I want to quote Atilio Verón, who's one of the most important intellectuals in Latin America. And part of what I'm trying to do here is to share with you what people are saying in Latin America, the important analysts. The U.S. is not, this is Atilio Verón, the former president of the Council of Social Research in Latin America. The U.S. is not interested in democracy in Latin America, and less so in Honduras. It is interested in message. They are not going to allow anybody to leave their sphere of influence. If Zelaya wins in Honduras, the retirement of the 7 bases in Colombia is more viable. It will mark the weakening of the U.S. presence in the region. Washington reads Zelaya triumph as Chavez's success. This error is taking the U.S. to further rejection in the region. Obama does not need internal enemies in the State Department. I mean, I'm not saying that I fully agree with that. I'm just presenting that to you also so that you can reflect about the situation. What are the implications? Isabel Raubert, another Mexican scholar, said, what is being rehearsed in Honduras is appealing to legal channels to end by force the processes of change that are developing in the region. The democratic cousin to the coup d'etat announces the new authoritarian style of the powers that be and reveals the true colors of its free market democracy. When it's convenient, yes. When it's not convenient, no. It is not a return to the past. It is the announcement of new strategies of an impotent right. New coupism, neogolpismo, is democratic and constitutional. Honduras heralds the opening of a new era of constitutional coups. This is a pretty strong statement. Leticia Salomon, Director of Scientific Research of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras, said that, and this is, the first one is the negative lesson, but this is the positive lesson now, this one. She said that nobody predicted the broad opposition to the coup. Because again, Zelaya was no charismatic leader of the people. He was voted president. But what happened because of this tremendous assault to democracy is really interesting. Nobody predicted the broad opposition to the coup. Contends that this is generating a new social force in the country with which any government will have to negotiate, and argues that for the first time in the history of Honduras, there is a profound struggle for democracy led by social movements. So according to this Honduran analyst, it happened to be the opposite of the effect. Greg Grandin, a U.S. analyst, the golpistas, have polarized society, that delegitimized political institutions, bankrupted the treasury, and empowered social movements. The coalition of workers, peasants, progressive religious folk, environmentalists, students, feminists, and gay and lesbian activists, I don't know any coalition like that in Honduras before, that has so emerged to demand the restoration of democracy, has so far not been able to return Zelaya to the president, yet it has prevented the consolidation of the coup regime. And this morning I was listening to Democracy Now!, and there are negotiations happening, and for Zelaya to come back, still advocating for a constituent assembly and for the elections that are going to happen in November. So these are some of the issues of the contradictions of democracy in Honduras. And now I am going to close with two quotes. The first is from Frei Beto. Frei Beto is a liberation theologist from Brazil. And I think this quote is really captured a lot of what I've been trying to say here. Latin America lived its best moment since decades, with the exception of Honduras. There are no military dictatorship in the region. Neoliberal governors, true to recipes of the IMF and World Bank, were rejected by popular vote. Today, we have popular democratic governments in 15 of 34 countries who commit to promote structural reforms through democratic and pacific means. The new is that the excluded, indigenous, peasants, blacks, the unemployed, the poor, now insist to be political protagonists. This is substantive democracy. This is the foundation of it. A clear proof is that a factory worker is the president of Brazil, an indigenous of Bolivia, an ex-guerrilla fighter in Nicaragua, a former political prisoner in Chile, another who's a feminist also, a woman, another ex-political prisoner in Uruguay, a progressive economist in Ecuador, a revolutionary military in Venezuela, a left-wing journalist in El Salvador, and a former liberation theology bishop in Paraguay. And that's all of that. I will say that justify the way that Noam Chomsky, in the 7th Social Summit for the Latin American and Caribbean Unity in Caracas, said that during the past decade, Latin America has become the most exciting region of the world. Thank you.